Picture, if you will, the largest city in Florida. Not Miami, not Orlando, not Tampa. A place with 12,000 residents, a deepwater harbor packed with tall ships, a gambling house, a horse track, palatial homes on wide streets, and enough ambition to make the entire Gulf Coast nervous. Now, picture that city gone. Not abandoned slowly, not faded gracefully over generations the way old towns usually do, but erased. Fever, fire, hurricane, storm surge that people at the time described as a wall of sea, as if the Gulf itself had made a decision. Gone in less than a decade. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Before it vanished, before the fever ship arrived, before the first ember caught, before the winds came, check, check, check. This city sat down in a grand convention hall and wrote the legal soul of the entire state of Florida, the Constitution, the one Florida still traces its bones back to, drafted right here in a city that would not survive to see its own work signed into law. You're listening to Drive Thru Towns, and today we're going to a place that did the most important thing Florida ever needed done, and then had the audacity to disappear. Pull up a chair. The water's warm. The mullet's smoking on the dock, and this story is about to get strange. When you drive into Port St. Joe today, which sits on the Florida Panhandle tucked into the curl of St. Joseph Bay, about 60 miles southwest of Tallahassee, you're going to see something that doesn't quite add up. The town is quiet, genuinely quiet. About 3,300 people, a low downtown, a working waterfront that smells, depending on the tide and the wind, like salt and diesel and something faintly charred with whatever's on the grill at the seafood shack by the dock. Blue herons standing in the shallows like philosophers who've given up on philosophy but haven't left the building. Nothing about it says capital of anything. And then you come to the museum, the Constitution Convention Museum State Park, and you stop because the museum is too serious for this place. The kind of serious that belongs in a state house rotunda, not tucked between pine flatwoods and a two-lane highway. Life-size mannequins mid-debate, exhibits on delegates and governance and the architecture of statehood. You look around at the pines and the silence and you think, what on earth happened here? That, friend, is exactly the right question. Let's go back, way back, to 1835. Florida is still a territory. It's been American for only 14 years, having been handed over from Spain like an afterthought at the end of a treaty. The place is raw, wild, and for the people already here, the Seminoles, the free blacks, the fishermen, the cattle hunters, it is a complicated, dangerous, often brutal world. But up in middle Florida, in the red clay hills above Tallahassee, cotton is king. And cotton, as anyone who's ever shipped anything knows, needs a port. The problem was Apalachicola. Apalachicola was the established port city. It sat at the mouth of the Apalachicola River, a great highway of brown water pouring out of Georgia and Alabama, carrying the cotton bales of 1,000 plantations down the Gulf. But here was the thing about Apalachicola that drove its commercial rivals absolutely to distraction. The shipping channel was shallow. Big ocean-going vessels had to anchor 16 miles out into the Sound. Every bale of cotton had to make that last stretch by barge. Tedious, expensive, maddening. So a group of wealthy businessmen looked at a map, looked at the deep natural harbor of St. Joseph's Bay, 17 feet deep, clean, accessible, and they looked at each other and said the words that have launched approximately half the disasters in American history. We can build something better. And they meant it. By 1835, the town of St. Joseph was being laid out on the shores of that bay. Streets were platted, lots were sold, Speculators arrived at a speed that should have been a warning, but was, at that time, interpreted as a blessing. And then they built something remarkable. In 1836, just 1 year after the town was founded, St. Joseph opened the first steam-powered railroad in the state of Florida. Not just one of the first in Florida, one of the first 3 steam railroads in the entire United States. The Lake Wimico and St. Joseph Canal and Railroad. 8 miles of track connecting the bay to a navigable arm of the Apalachicola River, engineered to steal the cotton traffic right out from underneath Apalachicola's nose. The locomotives were built in Philadelphia by a man named Matthias Baldwin. They pushed their trains from behind, from the rear, deliberately so that sparks from the engine wouldn't land on the cotton bales and set the cargo on fire. 20 trainloads of cotton a day were rolling into St. Joseph by the late 1830s. The wharf extended 1,800 feet into the bay so the trains could pull directly alongside the ships. Think about that for a minute. The year's 1837. Andrew Jackson is president. Most of the American frontier is still being mapped. And here, on a Florida Gulf Bay, a steam locomotive is pushing cotton bales out to ocean-going vessels on an 1,800-foot pier. By 1837, St. Joseph was the largest city in all of the Florida territory. 12,000 people, hotels, brick buildings, a gambling house that apparently earned its reputation, a horse track, wealthy planters rubbing elbows with sea captains and lawyers and men whose names would end up in history books. The wickedest city in the Southeast, some called it. One historian noted that description was offered more with admiration than alarm by the people who lived there. Now, here's where the story gets truly interesting, because ambition doesn't stay satisfied with being the biggest port in Florida. Ambition looks around for the next thing to win, and the next thing was statehood. Florida wanted to become a state. It had been a territory since 1821, and that was, frankly, getting old. Territories didn't have full voting representation in Congress. They didn't have the political weight that the cotton economy increasingly needed. There was a growing sense that Florida needed to grow up and join the Union properly. To do that, Florida needed a state constitution. Now, the natural place to hold a constitutional convention was Tallahassee. It was the territorial capital. It sat in the middle of the territory. It had the courthouse, the legislators, the official seal, all the things that say this is where the serious business happens. But Florida was not, in 1838, a place given to doing things the obvious way. The territory was deeply divided between East Florida, the old Spanish-influenced Atlantic coast, and Middle Florida, the new cotton and planter class interior. These two factions disliked each other with the thoroughness and creativity that would have impressed anyone. East Florida did not want Middle Florida running the Constitutional Convention. Middle Florida felt the same. Tallahassee, sitting right in the middle of Middle Florida, was considered by East Floridians to be permanently and hopelessly biased. And into the standoff stepped the boosters of St. Joseph, who pointed out correctly that their city was large, prosperous, accessible by sea, and not technically the capital of either faction. So St. Joseph got the convention. On December 3rd, 1838, 56 delegates from across Florida territory walked into a convention hall in the bustling city of St. Joseph and began the work of writing a constitution. They debated for 6 weeks. They argued over representation, over governance, over the structure of the courts, and yes, as any honest accounting must include, they argued over slavery. This was 1838. The Constitution they produced would protect the institution of slavery. That was the world they were building, and the world they were building it for, and we don't get to skip over that part. But they also built something else. They built the legal architecture of a state. the framework that would, 6 years later, allow Florida to enter the Union as the 27th state. The bones of Florida's government, how its courts would work, how its legislature would be structured, how its citizens would be represented. Those bones were assembled in that hall on the shores of that bay in that particular city in those 6 winter weeks. One visitor who attended the convention described St. Joseph at the time as a stirring place, its citizens full of energy and hope, fine buildings and hotels adorning the town, and more being built. That was the peak. That was the high watermark. Now, watch what happens next. The commercial peak passed before the ink on the Constitution was dry. By 1840, it was becoming clear that St. Joseph could not, in the end, beat Apalachicola at the cotton shipping game. The railroad had engineering problems. The waterway connections were unreliable. Sandbars, low water in summer obstructed channels. The town had leveraged itself hard on the bet that the cotton traffic would stay, and the cotton traffic began drifting back north. So, St. Joseph, with the flexible thinking of a city that had already reinvented itself once, made a pivot. It would become a resort, a pleasure destination. The wealthy families of Tallahassee and the interior would come to St. Joseph for the beach, the bay, the cool Gulf breezes, the gambling, the horse races, and for a brief, glittering moment, that worked too. Then the summer of 1841 arrived. Somewhere in the Caribbean, a fruit vessel took on cargo, and something else, something invisible, carried in the water that pulled in the bilges, in the barrels, and the holes, something that traveled in the bodies of mosquitoes that bred wherever standing water could be found. Yellow fever. The ship arrived at St. Joseph. The fever came with it. Within weeks, the disease was moving through the city. And here's the thing about yellow fever that made it so terrifying to people of that era. It did not distinguish rich or poor, planter or laborer, white or black, merchant or sailor. The fever found them all. The mosquito, which no one in 1841 had yet connected to the disease, because that connection wouldn't be scientifically established for 60 more years. The mosquito does not read a census. 3/4 of the population of St. Joseph died or fled within 1 year. Robert Reed, the 4th governor of the entire Florida territory, died of yellow fever he reportedly contracted in St. Joseph. His 22-year-old daughter, Rosalie, died shortly after him. His son-in-law, a West Point graduate and adjutant general of Florida, died too. The population fell from an estimated 6,000 to 400. The streets that had buzzed with commerce and ambition were quiet. And then, as if the fever were not sufficient, the fall of 1841 brought a hurricane. The wharf was destroyed. Not that it mattered much. There was almost no ships left to dock at it. Then wildfires swept through the abandoned town and the surrounding forest. By the time residents of Apalachicola arrived in 1843 to see what remained, they found something that takes a moment to absorb. They found a town with standing buildings, intact houses, whole structures, but no people. Not abandoned to ruin, just abandoned. So, they did the practical thing. They moved the houses. Some buildings were taken apart carefully, loaded onto boats and barges, and floated across to Apalachicola for reassembly. Some, and this is the part that makes you stop and stare, some houses were placed on barges whole, intact, and floated across Apalachicola Bay to a new life in a different city. There are houses standing in Apalachicola today that were born in St. Joseph. They crossed the water. They got new addresses. They don't talk about it much. Then in September 1844, the final hurricane arrived. The storm surge, what witnesses of the time called a tidal wave, swept over whatever was left of St. Joseph, and that was that. A Chicago newspaper reporter would later write, channeling the rhetoric of the age, Death's Angel. The hurricane had completed the work begun by its brother, Pestilence, and buried beneath the sands of the sea all that remained of the proud young city of St. Joseph. Some ministers and clergy around the country declared that God had destroyed the city for its wickedness. The gambling, the horse races, the whole gleaming, corrupted paradise of it all. Make of that what you will. The only thing left of Old St. Joseph today is a cemetery. The Old St. Joseph Cemetery, sometimes called the Yellow Fever Cemetery, sits in modern Port St. Joe, quietly off the main road. A collection of old graves, weathered markers, and according to local legend, mass graves whose full count was never recorded. Now, here's the detail that will either amuse you or unsettle you, depending on your disposition. The cemetery is located very close to the current office of the Gulf County Health Department. Whether that's a coincidence, historical irony, or the universe possessing a dry sense of humor, I leave entirely to you. The site remained largely empty for the rest of the 19th century. Then in 1910, a railroad finally came, the Apalachicola Northern, connecting the bay to the interior of Florida. And the town of Port St. Joe grew up at the port, anchored this time not by speculation and ambition and cotton, but by timber and industry. A paper mill opened in 1938. The paper mill closed in 1998. And then the place became something unexpected again, a destination. Not a destination of the grand ambition variety, not 12,000 people and a 1,800-foot pier and constitutional conventions, a quieter destination, the kind that people find when they've had enough of loud destinations. St. Joseph Bay is one of the healthiest natural bays on the Gulf Coast. Seagrass meadows stretching across the shallows, scallops in the summer, blue crabs moving sideways through turtle grass, horseshoe crabs patrolling the bottom like creatures that missed the memo that their era had ended. The peninsula across the bay, Cape San Blas, extending into the Gulf like a long bent finger, is a state park and one of the least developed stretches of Florida coastline still standing. Hurricane Michael came through in 2018 and rearranged things significantly, as Gulf hurricanes do. The community rebuilt, as Gulf Coast communities do. Because apparently the lesson this particular piece of shoreline teaches is that you rebuild, and you keep going, and you stay. If you stop at the Constitutional Convention Museum State Park today, and you should, because it's generally worth your time, you will stand in a replicated convention hall and watch life-size mannequins of delegates frozen in the act of making history. There's something quietly strange and moving about that. These figures representing Robert Reed, William Duval, David Levy, Thomas Baltzell, men who made Florida, standing in a small museum in a small town in a spot where 12,000 people once lived and now largely no one remembers. Down near the water, you can find fresh shrimp and fish from boats that still work the bay. There may be a cooler by the road, hand-lettered sign, cash preferred. The shrimp will be the best shrimp you've had in a while because it has not been on a truck. The bay will be blue-green and clear, and in the right light, late afternoon, when the sun comes across low, it will look like something that deserves to be left alone, which, for most of its history, it has been. So here's what you take away from St. Joseph, Florida. A city rose from a real estate dispute, built the first steam railroad in Florida's history, stole an entire constitutional convention from the territorial capital through sheer commercial swagger, drafted the legal foundation of an entire state, and then, before that state was even born, was destroyed by fever, fire, and a storm surge that erased the streets so completely that houses had to be floated to a new city to survive. The Constitution outlived the city that made it by 7 years, then by a decade, then by nearly 2 centuries. Florida's still governed in the lineage of its law by words written in a building that no longer exists, in a city that no longer exists, by delegates who are now mannequins in a small museum near a working waterfront. There's a word for that kind of legacy. Several of them, actually, in several languages. None of them are simple. But here, along the forgotten coast, under pines that have seen much and said nothing, surrounded by a bay so clean it still grows scallops, the story is just there, waiting, as it has been waiting for 180 years, for someone to stop, look around, and ask the right question. What on earth happened here? Well, now you know. This has been Drive Thru Towns. I'm your host, Andrew Wilcox. A special thanks to Chloe Jones for providing our music. If you enjoyed this journey, please follow the podcast to stay updated on all our upcoming episodes. To keep the conversation going, you can connect with me on Instagram at 50 State Family. Find me on LinkedIn under Wilcox Legal, or reach out directly via email at wilcoxlegal@gmail.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next road.
'Cause I was wandering free on an American dream with a million things to see and do. But it's all good, I'm fine. Had the time of my life, 'cause I did it all with you. Ooh.